After 10 long years away, Ethan drove into the valley he once called home. The road was still narrow, the air still cold, and the pine trees still whispered like old friends. But something was different. His father's wooden welcome sign was gone. In its place stood a white metal board that glared in the sunlight. "Property of Oak Ridge HOA. No trespassing." Ethan slowed the truck. For a long moment, he didn't move. The valley used to belong to his family, with every tree, every field, every stone. His father had cared for this land with his own hands. Now, strangers claimed it as their property. The deeper he drove, the more those signs appeared. Private road, no entry, HOA vehicles only. Every sign felt like a warning, as if the valley itself was rejecting him. When his old wooden house came into view, surrounded by new fences and trimmed lawns, one thing was clear. Someone had taken over everything he once loved. He hadn't even stepped out of the truck when a golf cart came racing down the driveway. A woman in a crisp blue blazer stopped right in front of him, dust swirling around her. Her name tag read, Karen, HOA President. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't smile. She only said one thing. "You can't be here." Ethan simply looked at her, his silence colder than her tone. She kept talking, calling him a trespasser, claiming the property belonged to the community now. Her voice was sharp, full of fake authority, but Ethan's calmness made her uneasy. Without arguing, he only told her to check her records and turned away. The way he walked back to his house, slow, confident, unbothered, made Karen's stomach twist. Something about this man didn't fit the story she'd been told. That night, the house felt frozen in time. The air smelled of dust and pine. Furniture stood covered with white sheets, just as his father had left them. Ethan lit an old lantern and began to search. Behind a broken shelf, he found a small metal box, rusted but still locked tight. He forced it open and froze. Inside were old papers, deeds, and letters, all in his father's handwriting. One envelope stood out. On it, a message in faded ink. "For Ethan, if the valley ever changes hands." Inside, the truth waited like a sleeping storm. It wasn't just the deed for the house. It was the deed for the entire valley. Every acre, every hill, every creek. His father had owned it all, and the ownership had passed directly to Ethan. The HOA's claims were built on lies. For the first time since returning, Ethan smiled. The valley had chosen its rightful heir again. By morning, the attack had already begun. Red HOA warning signs were nailed to his gate. A violation notice demanded $25,000 for illegal occupancy. Workers were repainting his driveway, turning it into a community parking zone. The road he had built with his father's hands was now blocked by concrete barriers. Karen appeared again, this time with 2 board members trailing behind her like guards. Her voice carried that same false confidence, but her eyes showed unease. She gave Ethan an ultimatum, 1 hour to leave. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. He wasn't going anywhere. When he told her she was standing on his land, the color drained from her face. She tried to reply, but the words died in her throat. He simply turned, walked back inside, and shut the door. The valley, once silent, now held its breath. For the next few days, Ethan vanished from the valley roads. He spent hours in the dusty archives of the county building, checking records no one had looked at in decades. The truth unfolded like a secret map. Every single property, every inch of road, every community park, all of it still belonged to Ethan W. Miller. The HOA had no legal ground. Everything they had built was technically on his land. Back in the valley, Karen's confidence began to crack. She called emergency meetings, whispering that a stranger was trying to take over. But whispers spread faster than fear. Neighbors began to ask questions. Who was this man the HOA called an outsider? And why was the president so desperate to make him disappear? The power that once made Karen untouchable was starting to slip away. On the 3rd morning, Ethan found one final notice taped to his door. "Vacate property immediately or face legal action." He laughed under his breath. It was time to end this game. He gathered the deed papers into a folder, locked the house behind him, and walked toward the HOA's community hall. Inside, the board sat in a circle, Karen at the head, her expression sharp and cold. But when Ethan entered, the room fell silent. Without saying a word, he laid the folder on the table and opened it. The first page alone was enough to drain all the color from Karen's face. It bore the official seal of the county. Property owner, Ethan W. Miller. Boundaries, entire Redwood Valley, 452 acres. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The air felt electric. Karen's hands trembled. The people she ruled over stared at her in disbelief. Ethan's voice finally broke the silence. Calm, steady, final. "I'm not the outsider. You are." The room stayed frozen, and in that silence, the mighty HOA began to crumble. The silence after Ethan's revelation lingered like a thundercloud. Karen sat frozen, her confidence shattered. The board members whispered among themselves, eyes darting from Ethan to the legal papers on the table. The words "entire valley" echoed in every mind. Karen tried to speak, but her voice broke. She claimed the documents were fake, that Ethan was lying. But even her closest allies could hear the fear in her tone. Within hours, the HOA office was in chaos. Phone calls, arguments, broken trust, everything Karen had built on lies was collapsing. Some residents started visiting Ethan's property, not to fight, but to ask questions. Who was he really? How could one man own everything they stood on? And most of all, what would he do with that power now? Karen knew the answer could destroy her, and she wasn't about to let that happen. The next morning, Ethan heard tires crunching on gravel. A black county SUV pulled up, lights flashing quietly. Sheriff Dugan stepped out, his hat low, his expression unreadable. Karen sat in the passenger seat, pretending to look calm. The sheriff told Ethan there had been complaints, accusations of trespassing and harassment. Ethan didn't argue. He simply handed over the same deed papers he'd shown the board. The sheriff flipped through them slowly, and his expression changed. He wasn't stupid. He knew what official seals looked like. Karen started shouting that the documents were forged. The sheriff raised his hand for silence. Then, turning to her, he said, "Ma'am, unless you have better proof, this man's within his rights." Karen's mouth fell open. Ethan said nothing. He just watched her turn red with rage as her strongest weapon, the law, slipped from her hands. Karen didn't stop. She couldn't. That night, HOA workers arrived with trucks and bright lights. They tore down Ethan's fence, claiming community maintenance. One man tried to cut the old oak tree his father had planted decades ago. Ethan stood in the dark, watching them. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. Instead, he took pictures, videos, and filed reports. Every action they took only strengthened his case. The valley echoed with the sound of chainsaws and shouts, but Ethan's silence was louder, the kind of silence that warns of a storm. By dawn, half the fence was gone, but so was their power. The county received Ethan's complaint before sunrise. When officials arrived, Karen's men scattered like frightened birds. The valley had finally noticed the battle, and this time it wasn't on Karen's side. Within days, word spread beyond the valley. A local news crew arrived, filming the now infamous HOA land scandal. They interviewed residents who admitted they never saw proof of the HOA's ownership. The story exploded online. Headlines calling it the HOA that tried to steal a whole valley. Karen's name became a curse in her own neighborhood. Reporters surrounded her house asking questions she couldn't answer. Her confident smile vanished. She hid behind closed blinds, refusing to leave. Meanwhile, Ethan stayed calm. He didn't boast. He didn't post online. He just kept restoring his home, one plank, one wall, one corner of peace at a time. The quieter he remained, the louder his victory grew. Karen's pride couldn't handle the humiliation. She gathered the remaining board members and tried to strike back. They forged new papers, tried to sue Ethan, and even threatened to rezone the valley to force him out. But every move backfired. Each lie uncovered another. The county officials launched a full audit. What they found shocked everyone. Misused funds, fake permits, even illegal construction on protected land. Overnight, the HOA that once ruled like a kingdom became a criminal investigation site. Karen's perfect world cracked. Her emails leaked. Her allies abandoned her. But even with everything falling apart, she refused to surrender. "If I go down," she whispered to herself, "he's coming with me." Ethan knew it wasn't over. Karen was desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. Late one night, he saw lights in the distance, someone moving near his barn. He approached quietly, every step slow and steady. When he reached the corner, he caught two HOA men pouring gasoline near the wooden wall. His voice cut through the dark. "You should leave, now!" The men froze, realizing they'd been caught. Moments later, sirens wailed through the valley. Sheriff Dugan arrived again, this time with backup. The men were arrested on the spot. One of them confessed. Karen had ordered them to send a message. The next morning, Karen was led out of her home in handcuffs, surrounded by cameras and flashing lights. Ethan watched from his porch, silent, unreadable. Justice hadn't just arrived. It had echoed through every inch of the valley his father built. The war for Redwood Valley was ending. But Ethan's final move was still to come. The valley fell quiet after Karen's arrest. For the first time in years, the roads were empty of HOA patrols. No more warning signs, no fake fines, no threats. The morning wind carried only the sound of rustling leaves and distant birds. But the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, like the air after a thunderstorm. Ethan walked across the land his father once tended. The grass had overgrown, fences were broken, and the barns were hollow shells. Yet there was beauty even in the ruin. Every broken plank was proof that the valley had survived the corruption. He began clearing the debris himself, one corner at a time. With every nail he removed, every sign he tore down, the land seemed to breathe again. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't over. Karen's empire had fallen, but her anger wasn't gone. 2 weeks later, the county courthouse overflowed with people. The hearing against Karen and the HOA board became the biggest local event in years. Reporters, residents, even old valley families showed up to witness it. Karen stood in the courtroom, pale and exhausted, but still trying to wear her old pride. Her lawyer spoke fast, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the HOA acted in good faith. But the evidence was undeniable. Ethan's legal documents, the forged letters, the fire attempt, the stolen funds. When Ethan took the stand, the room went silent. He didn't raise his voice or gloat. He only said one thing. "My father believed in community. She turned it into control." The judge's hammer came down like thunder. The HOA was officially dissolved. All properties returned to their rightful state. Karen was sentenced for fraud, trespassing, and property damage. The moment the verdict was announced, people in the courtroom clapped. But Ethan didn't. He simply turned and walked away. Victory was never his goal. Justice was. With the HOA gone, the valley slowly returned to life. Families who had lived in fear began to rebuild. They came to Ethan for advice, for permission to repair their homes, unsure of their place now that the land legally belonged to him. But Ethan didn't act like a ruler. He told them they could stay. No rent, no fines, no rules. "Just respect the valley," he said quietly, "and it will take care of you." At night, he'd sit on the porch, looking at the stars above the silent hills. He could almost hear his father's voice again, calm, patient, proud. The ghosts of the past no longer haunted him. They guarded him, yet beneath that peace, a shadow moved. In the empty house on the far ridge, a car engine hummed quietly. Karen had been released on bail, and she wasn't done yet. No one saw her return, but Ethan sensed it. Lights flickered near the ridge at night. Footprints appeared by the creek. Strange noises echoed in the barn. Karen was hiding, waiting for something. She had lost everything, her home, her status, her money, and she blamed Ethan for it all. Driven by humiliation, she planned one final act, to destroy the very valley that had defeated her. When Ethan found the footprints near the fuel shed, his heart sank. He knew that pattern, a plan born of desperation. That night he didn't sleep. He watched, he waited, and just before dawn, when fog rolled in from the hills, he saw a figure moving through the mist, heading straight for the barn with a can of fuel in her hand. Ethan ran toward her without hesitation. The air smelled of gasoline. Flames licked the wooden beams, spreading fast. Karen screamed as fire caught her jacket. Ethan reached her, dragging her out through the smoke, just as the roof began to collapse. The blaze roared through the valley night, orange light painting the sky. But Ethan had prepared for something like this. He opened the drainage gates his father had built decades ago. Water rushed through the channels, flooding the barnyard and drowning the flames. By sunrise, the fire was gone. So was the last trace of the old HOA empire. Karen sat on the ground, coughing, shaking, her face streaked with soot and tears. Ethan looked at her once, quietly, and said nothing. Some lessons, he thought, needed no words. Weeks passed. The valley began to heal. Burnt ground turned green again. Families replanted gardens, rebuilt homes, and laughter slowly returned to the air. Ethan rebuilt the barn, not as a storehouse, but as a memorial. Inside, he placed his father's old tools, the first valley map and the deed, framed in glass. At the entrance, a small sign read, "Redwood Valley, land belongs to those who protect it." Karen's name faded from memory, whispered only as a warning to those who let greed blind them. Ethan's name, though, became something else, a symbol of quiet strength. At sunset, he stood on the hill, looking over the wide valley below. The light spread across the fields like gold, touching every corner that once suffered. And in that silence, one thing was clear. The valley was free again. After the fire, peace finally settled over Redwood Valley. The nights no longer echoed with shouts or sirens, only the soft rustle of wind and the low hum of crickets. Ethan spent his days rebuilding not just his home, but the heart of the valley. The people who once feared the HOA began to trust again. They planted trees where fences once stood, painted over warning signs with colors of hope. But even in peace, Ethan stayed watchful. He knew the valley had scars, not just on the land, but in people's hearts. Some still whispered about the past, about the woman who tried to own everything and lost it all. Others whispered Ethan's name like a legend. He didn't want to be remembered as a hero. He only wanted the land to live free, just as his father dreamed. One evening, dark clouds rolled over the mountains. The valley sky turned black, winds howled, and rain poured harder than anyone could remember. Lightning struck the ridge, and the rivers swelled beyond their banks. Ethan rushed to open the floodgates, the same ones that had saved the valley from fire weeks ago. The water roared down like a beast unleashed. For a moment, it looked like the valley would be lost again. Not to men, but to nature itself. As the storm raged, Ethan stood in the downpour, guiding the old livers his father had once built by hand. Mud splashed against his boots, wind tore at his jacket, but he didn't stop. When the storm finally broke and sunlight pierced through the clouds, the valley was still there, battered but alive. He had saved it again, not from greed this time, but from the wrath of nature. Days later, the sun rose over glistening fields. The storm had washed away the last traces of the old HOA, the signs, the posts, even the old concrete barriers. Everything fake was gone. Everything real remained. Ethan began hosting gatherings for the residents, not as an owner, but as a neighbor. He shared his father's maps, teaching everyone how the land's water flowed, how to care for the soil, how to protect it from floods and fire. People listened. Children ran across the grass that once was forbidden. Laughter returned to the valley, echoing where fear once lived. Ethan watched it all quietly. He didn't need power anymore. The land itself was enough. One night, when the moon hung low over the hills, a quiet knock came on Ethan's door. When he opened it, he froze. Karen stood there, thinner, broken, eyes filled with regret instead of rage. She had served her time, lost everything, and returned to the valley not to reclaim it, but to say goodbye. She looked around, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought owning this place would make me powerful, but it only made me blind." Ethan didn't reply. He let the silence answer for him. She turned to leave, but before walking away, she said, "Your father would be proud. You didn't fight for land. You fought for its soul." For the first time, Karen's words carried truth. She disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the faint sound of footsteps fading in the mist. Months passed. The valley transformed completely. The people decided to hold their first Valley Festival, a day to celebrate freedom, unity, and nature. The fields were filled with lanterns, music, and laughter. At sunset, Ethan stood before the crowd. He didn't speak long, only a few words that everyone would remember. "This land doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who respects it." The crowd cheered, and for the first time in years, joy replaced fear. The valley had been reborn, not through laws or revenge, but through understanding and forgiveness. High above, the wind swept across the grass, carrying with it the spirit of those who once built this place, including his father's quiet pride. Ethan spent his later years turning the valley into something greater, a protected nature preserve. He wrote letters to future generations, detailing how the land should be cared for, how greed must never be allowed to return. Under his guidance, Redwood Valley became more than a community. It became a living promise. Families built homes that blended with the forest, not over it. The streams ran clear again, and wildlife returned to places once fenced off. People began calling the valley the land that fought back. But Ethan always smiled at that. "No," he'd say softly to himself. "It never fought back. It just waited for the right hands." Years later, on a golden evening, Ethan walked to the same hill where his father used to stand. The valley stretched before him, green, calm, endless. The wind brushed against his face like an old friend. He looked down at the memorial barn, its wooden sign glowing in the fading light. Redwood Valley. Land belongs to those who protect it. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, Ethan closed his eyes and smiled. The fight, the pain, the fire. It was all worth it. The valley was alive, free, and eternal, and in that quiet sunset, as the shadows lengthened across the fields, the story of the man who owned the entire valley and saved it from its own people came to an end. But the legend of Redwood Valley was just beginning.